reasonable doubt about whether the balance has been appropriately struck or inappropriately struck, not just with regard to this bill, but with regard to any bill that touches on fundamental human rights, such as free speech. What Parliament should do then is to err on the side of giving protection to the right rather than curtailing the right, because the right should be interpreted generously and the restriction on the right should be applied only where it is necessary.
Remember also that people have the right, and I speak as somebody who has been often the target and the victim of hatred, be it racial or religious, that people have the right to live their life without having that prejudice, that hatred directed towards them. The criminal law must protect people from that hatred. I think most of us will agree, for all the disagreements that we have in this bill, most will agree with the principle that hate crime legislation is required. And therefore, in my opinion, you must balance rights. You must balance the right of people to have freedom of speech, but at the same time, we must balance that with a right for people who are often the targets of hatred to be protected from that hatred. As a society and as a parliament, we have to get that balance right. I do not think the two are mutually exclusive. I think we can make sure we get the balance right for both.
I absolutely agree that the two are not mutually exclusive, but it doesn't follow from that getting the balance right between them is easy, and you're not, of course, implying that it is easy. Can I just ask you what the government's view is and what your view is about how far the right to freedom of speech extends? You mentioned in your opening remarks, Cabinet Secretary, both the Faculty of Advocates and the Law Society of Scotland. The Law Society of Scotland cites with approval in its evidence the well-known dictum from Lord Justice Sedley, that the right to freedom to speak only inoffensively is not worth having. And the Faculty of Advocates cites in its evidence the equally well-known dictum from Lord Roger, where he said that freedom of speech applies to information or ideas that offend, shock, and disturb. Do you accept that the right to freedom of speech in European human rights law extends to the right to offend?
Yes. And that's why the bill, there's not a word in the bill that deals with offence. People should have the right to be offensive.
Wow, I did say that I'd get around to doing this video, and honestly, I have not gone through the entirety of this 2.5 hour thing. I just can't get through it. I've watched bits and pieces here and there, and I mean, I've been trying to find the specific quote that was doing the rounds on Telegram and whatnot of him talking about people being prosecuted for things that they say in their home, and I haven't admittedly come across that bit yet. As tedious as it is, I'm trying to. Nonetheless, that right there, he says that people have the right to be offensive. Yet at the beginning of this 2.5 hour plus video, sorry, he talks about how he's been the victim of hatred, you know. So it comes down to, I could be offensive. I could say something offensive, and that's my right, according to him. But he could misconstrue that. He could see that as me being hateful. Who defines hateful? You notice he didn't elaborate when it came to the times he's been a victim of what he considers to be hatred. For all we know, that was somebody, whether that be an anonymous Twitter troll, or somebody trying to be offensive. And it's their right, according to him. It's all in the eye of the beholder. What separates offensive from hateful? It really depends on the person, the individual. And the fact that we have to sit here and pick our brains and try to figure out which would be considered hateful and which would not, etc., showcases the fact that this bill in its entirety is fucking pointless. It's ridiculous because it could be exploited. You have the right to be offensive, but you can't be hateful because people have the right to live their lives free of hate. What's the difference between offence and hate? Because one person could see something that's hateful, the other person could see it's not. This is going to get a lot of people into trouble. It might get thrown out of court, just like hate crimes tend to do anyway. He talks about specific groups that are more susceptible to hate. Doesn't elaborate. He doesn't define hate. What he's realistically talking about is the fact that there is little marginalised minority groups that are politicised for the purpose of far-left bullshit, and they need specific protections. Another thing that he actually says at the beginning of this video, which I have touched upon in previous videos, he goes into a little bit of detail about the fact that at some point down the line, they will be potentially adding in a clause. Well, they've got a clause, but they will be adding in at some point sex as a protected characteristic, but not sex in its entirety, women. Because they're going to be speaking to the Feminist Faculty Society, whoever the fuck they are. Really screams equality when specific groups are given preferential treatment and protections under the law, whereas others do not get the same treatments. Really gives you a picture, an eyesight into, or an insight even, into what group is targeted by this bill and what group are blamed for the creation of it to begin with.
People should have the right to express views that are controversial. This bill does not intend to deal with people who have offensive views.
But what happens if somebody sees an offensive view as hateful?
Stirring up offences, for example, which are the most controversial part of the bill, seek to do is to criminalise behaviour that is either threatening or abusive, or also has the intention of stirring up hatred. And that is for the new offences. Of course, the racial stirring up offence, I have to be clear about that, continues to have the threshold it continues to has had for the last 34 years. But for the new offences, the behaviour must be threatening or abusive with the intent of stirring up hatred. So that does not deal with offence. So what's also helpful to note is, since the announcement I made on the 23rd of September, the bodies that you quote have supported that change or proposed change. The faculty of advocates say the Scottish Government has listened to concerns over freedom of expression, which was voiced by many others, and proposes to amend the bill so that a crime will be committed only where the stirring up of hatred is intentional. The faculty welcomes that announcement. The Law Society says we are pleased that the Cabinet Secretary is actively seeking common ground and compromise to ensure Scots law is fit for the 21st century, and there are sufficient protections for the most vulnerable to prejudice in our society. We welcome proposals to strengthen the bill in relation to the new stirring up offences to include the requirement of intention.
Even after your amendments, however, Cabinet Secretary, it's still the case, isn't it, that this bill goes further than Lord Bracadell recommended. In Section 3 of this bill, for example, it is provided that a person commits an offence if that person behaves in a threatening, abusive or insulting manner. This is with regard to stirring up racial hatred. Lord Bracadell recommended that we omit the word insulting, and this is a recommendation which was supported by the Faculty of Advocates and the Law Society of Scotland. So why is the Scottish Government not listening to that advice?
But it's interesting, the one group you don't mention in that is, of course, those that are the most impacted by racial stirring up of hatred.
See? This is what he does. From the bits that I have watched throughout this whole thing, he turns it around continuously and tries to... He completely dodges the question and tries to make you empathise with the people that he claims are the victim of racial hatred. Still no elaboration as to what that is, but the question was about insultive behaviour. It was about insults. Now again, he switches it, he flips the switch and he talks about racial hatred. He's talking about insults. This prick likes to brag about how Lord Bracadale gave him all these recommendations and he's followed them down to a T. He fucking hasn't. He hasn't. Quite clearly. Because Lord Bracadale wished to remove insultive or insulting from said bill. And this dickhead, instead of answering the question properly, he immediately begins to talk about, well, what about the people that are the victim of said hatred? Just fucking unbelievable. Freedom of speech should exist. You cannot sit there and claim that you are in favour of freedom of speech, but then in the next breath try to justify a hate crime bill which would curtail speech. Freedom of speech should exist in its entirety, and the only time that speech should be curtailed is if you threaten or advocate violence towards somebody, or you act upon said threats, whatnot. That is the only time. If you threaten violence against someone, then yes, fair enough, the police should investigate. But if you're saying something that's considered insultive or offensive, which according to him's my right, if somebody misconstrues that and thinks that you're being hateful, I don't give a fuck. You know what I mean? It should be our right to offend. It should be our right to hate if we so choose. And this is ironic, coming from this fucking person who stood in our parliament with disdain in his voice, ranting and raving about every position of power in an ethnically Scottish country, which happens to be Scotland, being filled by a white individual. If that isn't racial fucking hatred, I don't know what it is, eh?
And that is a principle that I live by when making legislation. I've been a minister for...
Of course you do, because you want your brethren, your kin, to be protected under every fucking legislative proposal going there. Fucking snake, man. There's people, that's what I'm saying in the video that I just made before I'm recording this. These people, they are exploiting the system that has been gifted to them by progressives, quote unquote. They say the right namby-pamby words. But beneath the surface, there is an insidious motive behind this. He's essentially, if his bill gets, which it probably will, gets passed, it's to stop criticism of his religion, his people, at the detriment of ethnically Scottish men. And in case you didn't get what I was talking about earlier when I was talking about women, that's who's the target of this bill. That's who's responsible for the creation of this bill.
8 years in the government, and I've always thought that very famous principle of that what is about us without us is not for us is a very, very important principle to live by. I think you would agree with that, I suspect. And therefore, while I put a great degree of weight to the reflections, advice and expertise of the Faculty of Advocates Law Society, what I would say to you, convener, is I'd be very interested to hear the evidence, and I'm sure you will. I don't know for sure, this is a decision for your committee, but when you do take evidence from groups who represent those who are most...
Yeah, that's right. There's evidence. There's going to be more of these little shit shows taking place. So we're going to have a bunch of blacks, we're going to have a bunch of Muslims, we're going to have all these oppressed, marginalised groups. I'll tell you what we won't have. We're going to have women too, probably. The feminist society, faculty society. What we won't have... definitely Scottish men standing up for ethnic Scots. You won't have that. It's not equality when every group bar one is going to be protected by a bill. We're going to have evidence. We're going to have anecdotal fucking evidence for more anti-racist wankers that's supposedly going to sit there and argue the toss with the convener. It's just shit. I have sat here and made so many videos throughout the years, especially in the last 2 or 3 years in relation to Scotland especially, and I have seen it firsthand, what these people do, what these people say, what they think, and what they really fucking mean.
Targeted by racial stirring up offences and by racial hatred, they will tell you that
about white hatred?
They did not want any perceived, at least perceived dilution or weakening of...
Of course, but you're not talking about your average BAME individual. What you're talking about is the activist groups, these stakeholders, the very same people that work in cahoots with the government despite the fact they all claim to be independent. I mean, it was only like 3-4 months ago where they were talking about a social justice commission that was being set up. Who's that full of? Feminists and anti-racists. That's all this ever is. You're not talking to the average Joe in the streets. Because for all I sit here and I fucking rant and I rave sometimes about the BAMEs, your average BAME doesn't give a fuck about this stuff. This is the activist groups, the so-called pressure groups. And I say so-called because it doesn't take much pressurisation, does it?
The current stirring up offence of racial hatred, which has existed for 34 years, with barely, as far as I can see, but feel free to challenge this, barely any controversy whatsoever. So while Lord Bracadale made his recommendation and I reflected on it, while some who are experts, particularly in the drafting of legislation, we should not, must not, and I'm not suggesting you are doing this, discount the real life experiences of those who are the victims of such crimes.
No, absolutely. In this,
a crime. A fucking crime. We're talking about speech here. We're talking about speech. We're talking about things that have offended somebody. We're talking about racism. Verbally. If somebody does not physically attack you, if somebody does not physically harm you, if somebody does not threaten to harm you, it should not matter what you say or do in that respect. You should have the freedom to do so. You can say what the fuck you want. And that's the point. This stupid, ridiculous, ludicrous, tyrannical hate crime bill with this prick trying to justify it. Oh, he made little amendments. He's taken out the bit where whether or not you intended to stir up hatred, that's been scrapped. But if they can prove that you intended to stir up hatred, you're fucked. You can't say that you are pro-free speech while simultaneously trying to justify a hate crime bill which, by extent, curtails speech. It's as simple as that, wee Humza boy. Yusuf warned that although there are some compelling arguments for the potential to including a non-exhaustive list of examples for a reasonable defence, that he was not convinced it was necessary. He said, "I find it difficult to envisage a situation where behaviour can be threatening or abusive with the intent of stirring up hatred and yet be justified as reasonable." Oh, fucking give me strength. With the intent of stirring up hatred. I mean, how can you know someone's intent? You can't prove that. You can't. In some instances, potentially, but more often than not, you do not know what they're thinking. Such a list of exemptions could have unintended consequences, Useless said. Taking the example of adding a reasonable defence of journalistic expression to a list, he said, "What we wouldn't want to do is give the likes of Tommy Robinson a defence by saying that he's a blogger who writes for the Patriot Times, and therefore my reasonable defence is that I'm a journalist." But, I mean, for all I don't like Tommy Robinson, like, he's never said anything that isn't particularly true about Islam or Muslims, has he? The problem here is he said things that you don't like. And that is always the problem with these people. They do not like people going against the progressive oligarchy, so to speak. If he was sitting there calling arms to the whites and telling them to go and firebomb mosques, etc., I could see your point. But criticising, critiquing and pointing out the fundamental flaws of Islam is not hateful. You might see it as such, but it should be anybody's God-given fucking right to be able to point out said obvious, eh? He also disagreed in terms of principle and policy, with adding a defence for speech made in the home. As a parliament, even as a society, are we comfortable with giving a defence in law to somebody whose behaviour is threatening or abusive? Or, let's just give an example, which is intentionally stirring up... It's good that he throws in this example, because this is the only thing he's got to go on. Yeah, you know? If we remove his wee example, would his speech still make sense? Nonetheless, let's just give my only example, which is intentionally stirring up hatred against Muslims. Are we saying that this is justified because it is in the home? Yes! You can say and do as you please in the home. It is your right to say and do as you please. If you call for harm or violence, you might have a point. If you're saying something that Humza Yusuf finds offensive and or hateful, that is not anybody's problem bar Humza Yusuf. But this is the level of dictatorial BS that we are headed down with this fucking wanker at the helms. SNP, your Scottish Nationalist Party, this hate crime bill. I don't really hear Sturgeon coming out too much to criticise this bill, do you? No, you dunny do. No, you dunny. I wonder why that is. Because she knows herself. This is how she works the public, by the way. She knows herself that this bill's toxic. So she's not really said anything either way because she agrees with this bill. But if she comes out and says that she agrees with this bill, it's going to lose her some support. But if she comes out the other way, well, it's going against the fucking mantra, isn't it? She can't do that because she's in favour of it. If she comes out and says that she doesn't like this bill, then people will expect her to scrap it. Hence her silence.